many quick to draw parallels between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a possible future invasion of Taiwan by China. The West's massive support of Ukraine more than a veiled warning to Beijing should it move on Taipei. That warning driven home by NATO, which has vowed to boost ties with Asia in the face of regional threats. The U.S. appetite for a larger footprint in the Indo-Pacific also, in no small part, fueled by concerns about spillover from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, for more, let's speak with Daniel Russel. He's Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. He's also the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. Daniel, thank you for joining us. Now, what should we make from this latest news of this visit by China's top diplomat Wang Yi to Russia and the warning from the U.S. that China might be offering arms support to Russia?
Well, I think the Ukraine-Russia war has a huge and a negative impact on the U.S.-China relationship and therefore on the Asia-Pacific region. Thus far, China has limited itself to giving rhetorical, diplomatic, political support to Putin and his war against the Ukraine. And I think it's obvious that there's something that the U.S. is seeing that is causing concern that China may be slipping too close to the edge and providing perhaps dual-use equipment or otherwise assisting the Russian war effort. It's one thing to profit from Russia's war in the Ukraine, as China is doing, and to a certain extent India is doing, by access to cheap energy. But it's a very different thing to actually contribute to it in any material way, something that China's promised not to do. The other thing we've heard from China is hints that they're planning to roll out some sort of peace plan. And I think that news has already been greeted with a great deal of skepticism, in as much as China is simply not seen as an even-handed or a fair mediator, given its partnership with no limits, as declared by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin mere weeks before Putin moved his troops across the Ukrainian border.
And Daniel, observers have been saying that China is taking lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Would the Beijing be emboldened or discouraged by Moscow's struggles and economic and diplomatic isolation and its calculations about the possibility of taking Taiwan by force?
That's a great question. The Chinese are avid students of history and international development. So there's not a shadow of a doubt that the Chinese leadership and the Chinese military are picking apart the Russian experience with Ukraine and the lessons that are applicable to them. There are some similarities between Russia, Ukraine, and the PRC and Taiwan, in that there's a David and Goliath quality to both situations. Putin and Xi have a few things in common. They both use similar narratives about restoring lost imperial glory and about being victimized by the West. They both show a certain contempt for their smaller neighbors. But there are also very big differences. I think that one important takeaway for Xi Jinping is that the Russian generals were so wrong in whatever they had offered to Vladimir Putin by way of assurances of what they can do. And it's likely to cause the Chinese leadership, the political leadership, to be much more careful and skeptical about what the People's Liberation Army may claim that it could do with respect to Taiwan. I think beyond that, the Chinese can't fail to take notice to the cost to Russia and the solidarity of the West and much of the international community in objecting and, frankly, in resisting, not to mention the degree to which the Ukrainian people themselves have resisted. This is anything but a model of what Chinese leadership could tolerate in a military scenario, which I don't believe is actually their plan or their preferred scenario.
And what about the other big countries in Asia then? India is staying neutral while buying Russian oil. And then we have South Korea and Japan that are ramping up militarily.
I think India is a special case, quite different than China, as is Vietnam, in the sense that these are two countries with fraught relationships with the People's Republic of China, who are almost entirely dependent on Russia for their military equipment, maintenance, spare parts, ammunition. There's no quick way to shift from dependency on Russia for weapons to accessing other buyers. That's a multi-year, if not multi-decade transition. So in that respect, the Indians were stuck. They could not join the Western bandwagon of sanctions and overt opposition, whatever they thought. They need to keep their focus on what they consider to be their principal threat, which is China. Japan and Korea, I think, are unburdened by that complication and are watching with great trepidation and anxiety this flagrant violation of the UN Charter.
And Daniel, what are some of the key lessons that the U.S. can learn from its response to the Ukraine war, and how they sort of apply to a Taiwan conflict?
Well, one very practical lesson is the need for preparation, not in the form of flashy and glitzy weapon systems, but very simple things like ammunition. I think that there's probably some soul searching going on in the Taiwan military as well about what is needed there and what is needed from the United States by way of support to ensure that Taiwan can defend itself. The big lesson, honestly, I think, is the necessity for deterrence. And deterrence is often misunderstood as merely scaring the other side sufficiently to prevent them from taking action. And obviously, there's an important element of that in deterrence. You want the other party to believe that it can't easily succeed through military force. But the other half of deterrence is convincing the other country that they don't need to act. They don't need to attack. They don't need to use military force. And in the case of the mainland China and Taiwan, I think it's very important that the United States, Taiwan, that the world show not only resolve to oppose the use of military force, but also tread very carefully so as not to exacerbate Beijing's fear that somehow the window for unification is closing and that Taiwan and the United States, perhaps others, are conspiring to bring about a declaration of independence in the near term. It's in everyone's interest that Xi Jinping feel like he can afford to be patient.
And where does that leave the smaller nations in Asia, then, in particular for us here in Southeast Asia?
Look, I think there are short-term consequences from Russia's war against the Ukraine in the form of food insecurity, in the form of energy problems, and in the form of exacerbated major power strategic rivalry. And that's opening the door to Kim Jong-un, for example, to be even more unrestrained in his missiles and his other provocations. It's also depriving countries in Southeast Asia of the benefits of open markets, of reliable supply chains, It's depriving countries in Southeast Asia of something that they have every right to demand, which is that not only the United States, but China as well, the major powers fulfill their obligations to work on climate change, to work together, to work on the global economy, et cetera. Above that, all is the risk. The countries in Southeast Asia, the small countries in particular, I believe watched with horror when they saw what had been a gray zone situation, Russian troops massed but unmoving on Ukraine's border. And in a heartbeat, that was transformed into a full-on military conflict. There are plenty of gray zone risks from China in the South China Sea. For those risks to go from gray to black and white war has got to be a nightmare scenario for the countries in Southeast Asia.
All right, Daniel, I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your input today. Daniel Russel, a Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute.